briefly, I repeated more or less, and we had the lecture yesterday in Academy of Fine Arts in Novi. It was a lecture on new media department, and Evan actually given kind of first brief overview of the context of his own intervention on the exhibition. What I just briefly mentioned, how it's actually structuralized the exhibition in Berlin, and how you become a part of the first exhibition in Berlin, and now in Novi Sad's intention. Then Evan is again our guest, and I said, and you're stalling the exhibit first for today. Then so just exclusively present here for the guys here in Belgium. So Evan Snoudena. That's a mixture. Evan is also a teacher on Jork Univerzitet in Toronto, so he can also provide some other information than his own position. And yeah, more than welcome to present your work.
Feel free to ask him whatever you want. Feel free to ask us. I would just like to thank Zoran for this beautiful introduction, and to thank Ivan for.
And the book of the exhibition will stay in your school. So I'm giving to Uroš officially. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So thank you again for being here. Thank you, Zoran, for this introduction. I don't want to steal more of your time. So,
well, thanks for having me. That's really great to be here. And yeah, as Zoran mentioned, I'm a professor in communications at York University in Toronto. And I guess I'll get into talk about Edward Snowden and this project on this topic on the fear of the incomprehensible, digital art, data visualization, and Snowden files. I've been working on this for a while, I think about probably 4 years from the beginning of it. Starting with thinking about these files themselves, as we'll get to, and then thinking about what it means to talk about complex digital or technical issues with the general public, and whether it really matters if people understand what you're talking about or not, as long as you get a message across. But first, is everybody familiar with Edward Snowden? Is there anybody who's not familiar with Edward Snowden?
Not so much. I asked them already in
Okay.
Serbian. So basically you can set
okay.
the keywords. Yeah.
So briefly, Edward Snowden is or was a contractor for the National Security Agency, the intelligence services of the U.S. government, who left the United States in 2013 and gave a huge collection of documents to two journalists, Glendon and Laura Poitras, that basically document how the United States, with cooperation from many other world governments and corporations to different degrees, surveil basically the entire world's population and the way that we communicate digitally across the world, whether it's using the internet or communicating by cell phone. What we do is all being surveilled in some sort of way. And so these documents show how that happens. I have in this suitcase an archive of the Snowden documents that have been published online. We don't have access to all of them that haven't been published, but these are all that have been published. Usually when news organizations publish stories, they publish the documents that they're working with. And so there are around 1,200 documents that have been put online and that we have in this suitcase here. In 2013, 2014, shortly after the leak happened, some colleagues of mine in Toronto had started the first online archive of the documents, the Snowden Digital Surveillance Archive, and I decided to build an offline version so that people can do research without being surveilled online. And if you all have smartphones or a laptop, if you take out your smartphone or your laptop, you'll see a Wi-Fi network in this room right now called Snowden Archive. So if you take out your phones and connect to the Snowden Archive Wi-Fi, you'll be able to access the archive and follow along throughout the talk, but also access these files.
Because we have the server in this box.
Yeah.
Nice. You can't download experience, but you can download stuff.
So yeah, once you're connected, go to the website http://nsa.gov. And you'll be connected to the web server that's inside this suitcase.
We should make it try.
And so before we get into the specifics of what all this stuff means, think about some of the implications of being watched all the time. And if anything that you communicate, any way you talk with anybody, anything you do online, you consider to be private. Or if you're an artist or might be profiled by an algorithm as being an artist, and what some, I guess, algorithms might think is wrong with that. Likewise, if you're a politician or have aspirations to be politicians, if you're an activist, if you have anything to do with sex or drugs online. For me, a big part of the way that surveillance works, or the apparatus of it, has to do with the history of communications. And so it used to be that we communicated at a distance by telegraph, and so human beings were really integral to the keeping of somebody's privacy. In the 1800s and early 1900s, people would give a message to a guy like this, who would then encode it, tap it out into a message going over a long cable, where somebody else would hear it and turn that message of beeps into a message that would be passed on to somebody. And so we always had somebody whose job was to keep our privacy. And then later in the 1930s, 1950s, we had telephone operators who physically put us in touch with somebody. We would call an operator, we'd say, I want to talk to this address, and they would literally make a connection from one cable to another and create a physical link, but also ideally keep secret who you were talking to. That wouldn't be public information. And privacy is something really tangible. It's not an abstract idea. It's human rights law. It's Article 12 of the UN Declaration on Human Rights and the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, that no one should be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, or correspondence. And reading this, you think, okay, everything I say online should fall under here. Everything I say on a phone should be considered something that's private. But the way that we communicate has changed pretty dramatically. Does anybody here not have a phone on their body right now? So everybody has a phone. Your phone's always communicating in some sort of way. It has lots of little radios in it that are connecting you to a cell phone tower, to a satellite, to Google or to Apple. So there are corporations and government entities always keeping an eye on where you are. And it's a basic part of how our telephones function. But today we've traded these human beings who keep our privacy for a bunch of faceless corporations that really don't necessarily adhere to any sort of privacy law. That can do what they want, more or less, with their information, so that they deliver a product that works well, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it keeps our privacy well. But our relationship with these companies has changed also pretty different ways. I know pension plans are complicated in Serbia, in other parts of the world. A lot of us who, for instance, are public employees have pension plans in Canada. If you are employed in Canada, you pay into a federal pension plan, and often provincial ones that invest in different companies. In 2016, when I started doing this research, I realized that, and I was looking at Montreal all the time, these 3 and O2 were 2 of the biggest British telecoms, and were merging, and I realized that I had some of my money had gone actually into this merger because I was working in Canada and in Quebec, and so the 2 pension plans that I paid into leveraged and made this deal happen. But I didn't have any say in the way that it happened or in how these companies operate. So a lot of times, billions of dollars of public money or of private money is used in different ways to make industry happen in different ways without the actual owners of the money having a say in how it functions. This is my pension plan today. We're at work at York University. It's invested in a bunch of different telecoms in Canada, Japan, and Hong Kong, around $32, $33 million of university employees' money put into these companies, but again, having no say in how they function. It's even bigger in the UK, and as we'll see, the UK plays a big role in mass surveillance worldwide. This is the pension plan of the University professors of the UK. All universities are sort of grouped together. And in 2016, there was about £254 million that was invested in different telecoms. But again, so you have people teaching about mass surveillance, people being critical and doing advocacy and activism around mass surveillance, while at the same time, part of their salaries is going into facilitating it happening. Part of the history of mass surveillance has to do with what's called the Five Eyes. So post-World War II, the US, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada got together and formed this sort of union of intelligence agencies that spy on the world more or less and share information, but aren't supposed to spy on each other. What does this mean every day? So for anybody in here who may have been to a protest, for instance, in 2009, I'll go through a couple different somewhat recent examples. In 2009, the G20 meeting happened in London. The G20 is a group of the 20 sort of largest democratic economies in the world. At the G20 in London, the GCHQ, which is the British intelligence agency, and the NSA, set up fake internet cafes. So if you think of thousands of activists converging on the city of London to protest economic decisions being made outside any sort of democratic participatory system, you arrive in the city that you don't live in. In the mid-2000s, nobody had smartphones. We were all going to internet cafes. And you didn't really do any research about what internet cafe you went to. You just went to what was around. And so they set up a number of fake internet cafes to spy on people's communications. BlackBerry cell phones used to be known as the most secure form of cell phone communication. They figured out how to hack BlackBerry phones and monitor them. There was 24/7 telephone surveillance, detargeting of diplomatic communications. Diplomats usually are sort of, you can't touch them, spy on them, you can't arrest them, but in this case you can spy on them. Also internet email and web browsing surveillance, both through internet cafes and generally through the city of London. The following year, there was a G20 meeting in Toronto, and the NSA collaborated with the intelligence services in Canada to, again, spy on people, on activists in Canada. But what does this mean for sort of everyday people who aren't necessarily activists? And a lot of this we can get out of documents that you can see on your phone through this archive in the box. I'll go through a few of them. This is one of the first stories that came out in the media, a program called PRISM, that showed where how the NSA between the 2007 and 2013 gained direct access to the infrastructure, the servers of Microsoft, Yahoo, Google, Facebook, Paltalk, YouTube, Skype, AOL, and Apple. And so anybody using these services during that time, and probably today, was a victim of mass surveillance.
Is it illegal?
It's a good point. It's hard to say. Privacy law is a vague area. In Canada, for instance, we have privacy law, but we have a federal privacy commissioner, and all provinces have privacy commissioners, but they don't have actual judicial powers. They can't do anything to anybody. They can't punish anybody for violating somebody's privacy. In Europe today, with the GDPR, there's certainly be more heavy fines that you can put on corporations for violating people's privacy. But governments, as things that should be regulated themselves, don't really do that very well. So it's not necessarily illegal in a way for government to violate people's privacy. I'll get to some other challenges a little bit later on. There are continuously cases, mostly in the UK, a group called Privacy International, that regularly takes the UK government to court around mass surveillance. In the US, there have been a few cases, but there's been nothing monumental. And so government, for me, national governments are in a weird place where they're supposed to protect your privacy, but it's also, it seems, part of their mandate to violate your privacy. So in more detail, what this meant, what certain information the NSA got through this program is access to your email, your chat, videos, photos, stored data, file transfers, video conferencing, social network details, etc. And they did this in two different ways. There was direct access to servers, but also to the fiber optic cables that our communications run around on. You might not know there are about 365 fiber optic cables that encircle the globe that our communications run over. So when you communicate on your cell phone, it goes through radio signals to the cell phone tower, and then likely through cables that go around the world to maybe New York or San Francisco to access the information you want to get, and then communications come back. And so they were capturing information from two different locations, one from the servers and another from the traffic that's out there on the internet, and then comparing the two and having really consistent data to look at. This is all shared with various people. This is another document from the SUN files where you can see different intelligence sharing agreements between the US, the UK, Canada, and New Zealand, and other groups and countries. You'll notice Serbia is not on this list of countries that they share intelligence with. And as we see a bit later, we'll get into what we can actually learn from this article about Serbia. It seems that Serbia is one of these countries that the US can spy on indiscriminately. But in a sense, that's not necessarily anything special. Mass surveillance is pretty indiscriminate on a global scale. This was one of the bigger surveillance programs that was disclosed and uncovered by the New York Times. I think called Fairview, that ran from at least 2003 to 2013, where AT&T, which is one of the biggest American telecommunications companies, but also operates internationally, was shown to have given access to their domestic and international networks to the NSA, and we're handing over around 1.1 billion cell phone records every day. By cell phone records, I mean records of who called whom, where they were, how long they spoke for. And so you think 1.1 of these records per day, we have around 7.5 billion people on the Earth. Roughly a seventh of the world's population in terms of phone calls was being surveilled every day. And so you can create a pretty in-depth modeling of who talks to whom, when, and how, and what that might mean.
That was first revealed by Mark Klein, right? 2005, I think that was.
The beginning of it, yeah. He divulged that this was happening. Right. This was actually the details of it. Yeah. So Mark Klein was a technician for AT&T who was working in their international, I forget the name of the building.
One of the backbones of the internet.
Yeah, in San Francisco, 2005, 2006, yeah. And discovered that AT&T had let some anonymous government workers install a system that was making an exact copy of all the traffic going out internationally, and for the purpose of surveillance. And he went public with it as a whistleblower. I believe they went to court and nothing really happened.
Retroactive immunity happened.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So yeah. Then George Bush was in power, and they gave. Technically, it should have been illegal for this to happen. And post 9/11, George Bush pushed through a law that gave telecommunications companies retroactive immunity for all mass surveillance cooperation with government. So technically in the US it is perfectly legal for telecommunication companies to collaborate with the government to surveil people. In the UK, GCHQ, the government communications headquarters, it's a British intelligence services. They built a system called Tempora that was launched in 2008 that basically did the same sort of thing that happened in California, but at a higher scale. It's based in Butte in the UK on the sort of northwestern coast. That if you look on a map of internet topography, you'll see a lot of European internet traffic is forced to go through the UK. A lot of North American traffic is forced to go through the US. And most of this probably happens so that it can be surveilled either by GCHQ or the NSA. So this system here was basically a system to suck up all internet traffic that was going through the UK, and it was shared with the NSA. This was challenged by Privacy International, an NGO based in London, but also challenged by, I believe, 2 or 3 sitting MPs and 1 former MP who said, hey, we're politicians, you shouldn't legally be able to surveil us. They challenged it to the Investigatory Powers Tribunal, which is a court in the UK for surveillance, and they lost. They were told that no, it's actually perfectly legal to spy on politicians. The government can do this. A couple other interesting mass surveillance systems or projects that came up. One called Current Police, that was named after a famous Radiohead song, whereby they built sort of a superstructure on top of a number of massively popular websites to watch what people are doing online. So GCHQ especially managed to infiltrate Facebook, BBC, Hotmail, YouTube, etc., and gather up data on people's everyday web browsing activities. So these are things that happen to people sort of indiscriminately online. What can we see from these documents that has to do with Serbia in particular? One is bulk surveillance. So this, again, is sort of generalized, but here you can see a list of the different countries that the US, or the NSA rather, is authorized to spy on indiscriminately. And so you see a pretty exhaustive list. There are a couple other pages with other groups of countries. But down here you'll see Serbia just after Senegal and before Seychelles. This is sort of a legal opinion showing that the US can definitely spy on all the countries. Another, for me, more interesting thing is cell phone surveillance. So in, I think, 2015, an online publication called The Intercept broke a story showing how GCHQ and the NSA had infiltrated one of the world's biggest manufacturers of SIMs. When you use a cell phone, your SIM has an encryption key that's unique to your SIM that ensures that your connection to a cell phone tower is encrypted. Nobody can intercept and understand the signal between the two. They managed to hack one of the biggest manufacturers and make about 2 billion SIMs per year, based in Belgium, and steal thousands, potentially millions of encryption keys so that they can surveil people's cell phones without anybody knowing about it. You can see here, Mobitel is the one European telecom that they included in this list of companies they were looking at. So you have Serbia, Iceland, India, Afghanistan, Yemen, Iran, Tajikistan, and Somalia as being the first group of countries that they're looking at using this technology in. I'm not sure why Serbia was singled out. Maybe it's sort of a test case looking at how to do this sort of work more broadly in Europe. Now I want to shift gears a little bit, and I'm wondering if anybody wants to come up and open up this suitcase and see what's inside, especially somebody who's been using the archive on your phone today. All right. Yes, go for it.
You're scary.
Later you're going to tell us about your like border adventures and
Yeah, I can refer to that.
airport adventures.
So this is something like Wireshark, I would imagine. It's I don't know. It's
okay.
All the traffic that's going across. We've got yeah, IP addresses. Kind of like some sort of.
Yeah, if other people want to come and take a look at it, you can.
Yeah.
We can pick it up and show it.
I won't describe it.
See for yourselves.
So when you communicate online or when you're looking at the archive on this machine, your phone's having digital conversations with some other machine on the other end and sending out messages, getting messages back. This is what those messages look like. So inside here, I'll show you I have two Raspberry Pis, little mini computers that cost about 15 euros each. One's running a Wi-Fi network and a web server, and the other is running a Wi-Fi sniffer that intercepts the signals between your phone and the Wi-Fi network, and it's playing those conversations back on the screen here. So this is what it looks like when you communicate online. Most of your communication online isn't encrypted, isn't secure, and so this is how easy it is basically for a machine or a human being to pick up what you do online. And so I started working on this project as somebody who used to work in IT, and when the online archive was launched by some friends of mine, I said, hey, this is a fantastic thing, but if you want to see who's looking at this, who wants to do research on Snowden files, the NSA just has to look who's going to your website. And so I wanted to build an archive that was offline and easily replicable, so people often download these images from me. You can download a 32 gig image for a Raspberry Pi and put one up anywhere. But I wound up building it in this nice little case, and it turned into art in some accidental way.
That's another topic. What's the connection between digital art and art in general, and then these things that you're talking about?
Yeah, for sure. And that's what I've been thinking about.
The question of data aesthetics.
Yeah, that's what I've been thinking about more in the last couple of years. But the original plan was to do something. I really work with people more intelligent with me about data visualization and do something more interesting than just numbers going by our screens.
Exactly.
And then I did some large-scale installations, say with an audience of 1,000 people, and people were terrified. And I was thinking, well, do I need to do anything more complex? If somebody is reading, say, a top-secret CIA document, and they see the screen reacting to them, that seemed to be that was all that I needed to do. That I didn't necessarily need to get into something more complex that goes more in depth into what this stuff is. And maybe we can talk about that here. I sort of came into this not as an artist, and started working on things that were interpreted as art, but also started working with the Berliner Gazette. So the group that Mihajla over here works with in Berlin invited me to Berlin in 2015. The Berliner Gazette organizes big sort of social conversations every year. 2015, was it 14? 2014, they organized one called Tacit Futures, and invited me with the Snowden Archive in a Box to be sort of part of this workshop on Snowden Files for All, thinking about how we can interpret these files in different ways and use them in different ways, put them into the hands of different people. Thinking about, is it a good thing if they just remain these really sort of technical documents? Can we take these ideas and put them out there into popular culture, into the hands of playwrights and musicians, and et cetera? So this has, over the years, evolved into the exhibition that's in Novi today, called Signals, and looking at really how the raw material of Snowden archives can be turned into art, into the commons, and appreciated in different ways. There's Christian Wasnicki and Megan Natal, who are behind Berliner Gazette and Signals. And I'll go through some of the art that's part of the exhibit. Not all of it is Novi Sad, a lot of it is. This was the first exhibition in Berlin about a year and a half ago. This is a piece by Jacob Blaise, which is in Novi Sad right now.
It's one of the works of the exhibition.
Yeah.
So what is it about? Maybe in like 2 sentences.
Yeah, this is called Undressing for X-Keyscore. X-Keyscore is something I didn't cover, but it's basically a giant database and data exploration system that the NSA and GCHQ use to explore mass surveillance data. And in here he puts together some maybe real, maybe fake social media profiles on gay dating sites and mixes them up with the graphics and interfaces from X-Keyscore.
These are not the real interfaces. This is how the interfaces
it may be, yeah. Some of the graphics are definitely from the documents. Some of them look like they're from the documents. It's hard to see which is which.
In general aesthetics, he's actually playing with the positive and negative color screen. So his portrait is also on a screen, so it's also coming out as a gay artist and to proclaim himself instead of that, and then putting all these data together with this. So the idea of Željko's work is actually to make this.
Željko Blače.
Yeah, Željko Blače, yeah. So he has actually made that's the same poster. It's just one and the other side. So basically, it was provided, and people could actually take a poster with them.
Yeah, and then in Berlin at the launch, he was doing a signing of posters for people and framing them, put them on your wall.
We miss him for signing the posters, you know. So it was
This is a piece I think by Simon Denny. A lot of the graphics that are in these documents are kind of amazing and bizarre. And if you just, I think it's interesting to try and look at these documents and appreciate them in different ways. So some of the writing is really kind of mystical and humorous.
That's what I really liked about your part at the top in Novi when you said that it has some sort of literary quality.
Yeah, absolutely.
The writing in these documents, even though it's official, legal, and bureaucratic, still it has humor in it. And
especially the British stuff. You can tell that the British stuff is British. Some of it's really very funny.
Do you have some examples?
I don't, unfortunately. But if you look in here at some of the GCHQ documents, especially the ones that there's some that have like really sort of psychedelic leprechaun graphics. Yeah, the aesthetic throughout a lot of the documents is really pretty amazing. And a lot of this stuff isn't that far off from the original.
Because there are some graphic design students here, I think they'll be quite interested in
yeah, I mean,
appropriating these graphics and playing with them.
Yeah, if you look at the documents and think of them as source material
to
create things out of, instead of just these scary technical things that are hard to understand. There's a lot there. It was a very child-friendly exhibition also, so they had coloring books of Edvarda Snoudena set up for kids. There's performance art. It's a side dot from Tokyo. And so coming out of this, I've been thinking about really how do we, I guess, appreciate this stuff as source material in different ways, whether it's in popular culture or art, policy, activism, protest, music, research, and how do you sort of create connections in between all these things? Because if the Snowden files just remain the domain of sort of academics or policy people, then it just remains this really sort of niche sort of fight. It doesn't really become something other than the public consciousness. I've done some interesting installations with this. So one of the first installations I did with Snowden Archive was at a film festival in Bologna in 2015 called Biografilm. It's a big biographical film festival, and they were screening Citizen 4, the documentary about the Snowden file leaks at the festival. And they were at a summer school running alongside it. So they asked me to do a sort of master class on privacy and freedom of expression, and then invited me with the students to do an installation during the awards ceremony cocktail. And so this big film festival cocktail set outside, and students went around and interviewed people about their thoughts on privacy, on that surveillance by Edward Snowden, and talked to them about using the archive itself. Some people wanted to use it, some people were terrified to connect to it, think that Edward Snowden would sort of infiltrate and possess their cell phones. It was really amazing to see how different people and a really diverse general audience in Bologna interpreted and used this thing. There are a couple others around. So this is one that I built for Cambridge University in the UK. That's used for teaching in the sociology program. Originally they installed it on this plinth in one of their buildings for about 6 months. So it's sort of on display as a museum piece. But people could also use it. Now they use it to teach one of their sociology classes around the political economy of data, what data looks like and how you use it and how to think about it. In the last month or so, I've done a couple installations in Toronto, and then last month another installation in Bologna, and then finally I'm here with you in Serbia. Next month, I'm building the first permanent installation in the library, so at Ryerson University in Toronto. They'll soon have one set up permanently in their library, maybe in the body of the mannequin, we're not sure yet. But one of the other sort of purposes for which I built this archive was to give institutions a gray area to work in. At first, when the online version of the archive was built, Ryerson was interested in hosting it as part of their institutional archive, but their lawyers said they shouldn't. Because they could maybe get sued by the US government for hosting and providing access to these stolen documents, which they still consider to be stolen, which are still considered to be top secret documents. If you look at the front page of the archive, there's actually a disclaimer, a warning to U.S. federal employees. A few years ago, one of my colleagues, Andy Clement, was doing installation in Boston at a conference, and was asked to add this disclaimer in. It says, if you're a U.S. federal employee, it's illegal for you to look at these documents. You probably don't have a security clearance, and if you have, you should inform your supervisor so they can fire you, basically. But now that I have this version on a Raspberry Pi, you can either do a more dramatic installation like this, or in a mannequin, or you can hide it in a wall and plug it in, and it just lives as a Wi-Fi network. It gives institutions this sort of gray area to work within and provide access while not being responsible for it. So I just want to give a couple of examples of work in this area, what's called watching the watchers. How do you look at who's looking at you? This is one project by a couple of friends, Ed Clement and another friend, Jonathan Obar, on documenting surveillance cameras, which I've been told have become a much more prevalent thing in Serbia. In Canada, there's fairly rigid privacy law around it, but not very good enforcement. And it's a project that started in university classes. I used it in some of my classes and sent students out to document surveillance cameras that they come across in their everyday lives, and to determine whether they've been installed legally or not. And then if they want, they can go through different procedures to contest them, to complain about them, etc. Another project, this is called IX Maps, a project looking at how internet traffic in Canada works. So a bit like Serbia, Serbia has more undersea cable connections than Canada does. We have just one cable that goes out of Canada to the rest of the world. About 25% of Canadian internet traffic, if it's going inside Canada, has to go to the US first to get back to Canada, because we don't have a huge country with very little infrastructure going across the country. And so as soon as Canadian internet traffic goes into the US, it's subject to US law and US surveillance. I've been looking at what happens with Serbian internet traffic and saying that, like if I go to the New York Times website, for instance, I get bounced around Europe a fair bit and then over to the US. So definitely if I go to the New York Times, a lot of different websites will set up servers in different parts of the world to speed things up. But a lot of American companies are still based physically in the US, so your internet browsing gets surveilled going through the United States. Another project that I've been working on is looking at the US-Canadian border. So this is sort of an amalgamation of my research right now. A sort of broader project called Border Probes. Another way I've been thinking of data is, if any of you travel internationally, on Serbian passports or otherwise, you have to go through a border and something happens to you. So thinking about and trying to document what happens to people when they go across the US-Canadian border, or really any border. What data is created out of your body when you go across the border, whether your picture's taken, whether your fingerprints are taken, or your retinas are scanned. What data is created and where does it go? What cable does it travel over? Where is that data kept? What laws is it subject to, and who can access it? Another project that's, today part of this project is traveling with Snowden. So this is probably my 8th or 10th trip to Europe with this suitcase. Really documenting what happens to me traveling with this. Not much does, strangely enough.
Strangely enough. I would expect at least some unpleasant questions, or
Me too.
spending with the border police, something like that.
I've been trying. But I'm an American and a Canadian, and my dad's a retired judge in the U.S.
Oh, okay.
And so part of what my research is trying to see how far I can push my white male privilege. If you've seen Citizen 4, there's a scene where Glenn Greenwald's husband, a guy named David Miranda, who's a Brazilian guy, is traveling back to Brazil with a bunch of these files, and is detained for like 10 hours in Heathrow Airport. Because he's a brown Brazilian guy traveling with a bunch of illegal documents. And so, sort of based on that, I've been traveling with this thing a lot, talking about it a lot, and trying to see what happens to me. And I've had a couple awkward conversations, but no interrogations. The
Tell
one,
them what it is.
nobody asks what it is. The closest I got was once I was giving talks in the UK and Berlin, and I've gone back to the UK, and the guy looked at my passport and said, "So you were here 4 days ago, and you were here 2 months ago, and what do you do?" And I said, "Oh, I'm an academic, I'm giving some talks." And so I'm holding this suitcase, and I have to catch a bus in like 10 minutes, and I say, "Mass surveillance." Said, "What?" I talk about mass surveillance. "Okay, who pays for your travel?" "People who invited me." "Okay, see you later." But nobody, sometimes people ask me to take it out, they look at it and say, "Oh wow, that's really cool. Did you build that off like an internet plan?" Like, "No, I built it myself." "Really? Wow." And here's what it looks like inside. I mean, it could be a bomb. And so for me, sort of, I come from a history of activism, and for me, a lot of this work I want to help bring around the actual legislative institutional reform in terms of surveillance and how people get treated, but also in how we think about these things. And okay. And so the final part of this talk is actually going to be completely up to you. It's going to be time to turn really things for you to perform as an audience. And we had fun with this Novi set yesterday. And so I want to ask all of you to get it either into groups or individually. Go and
Yeah. At least 2 persons is a group.
Yeah. Maybe we can form.
And you can choose, these are suggestions of things to
yeah,
create.
but it could be something different.
Yeah, it could be something different as well.
Yeah.
Group 2.
So you could write perform a song, make an illustration, a poem, a dance, a short story. Take half an hour or so. These would be, we have lots of time, right?
A video, website,
Yeah.
little program, whatever.
Yeah.
And so take 30 minutes and go and create things. Use the Stone Archive as sort of some inspiration, what we've talked about today. If anybody has any questions, we can talk about that now before you go and create stuff too. And then we'll regroup in like half an hour and perform.
That sounds perfect. So guys, do you have any questions? The scariest question in the world is, do you have any questions?
Ask me anything.
Put questions up in your performance. If not yet.
And everybody is free to participate, like students and all other guests, colleagues, professors, whoever wants to play.
Ne bi trebalo budu free, nego obligate to participate.
Wow.
No, students are obligated. You are not